before we go on to this evening's topic, these 4 philosophical systems, is there any questions left over from the meditations today?
I wanted to ask, during the being aware of the awareness, I felt during this practice a certain tightening in the soul. And is it tension, sign of tension?
So the question is, during this resting in awareness practice, there was some tightening in the throat. Is this tension? Probably. This practice, because it's quite subtle, there can be a tendency also to tense, as with the mind practice. So particularly this practice is really very important to be super relaxed, because if we're not super relaxed, will sort of push us into this sort of doing mode, striving mode. And so we really want to be just in this resting being mode. And it'll be much easier for that if we're really, really relaxed. So, you know, really try and relax the body as much as possible, mind as much as possible. And if you notice any tension or so forth like that, then again, really just release your awareness and just release all appearances and just relax completely. Just really emphasize that relaxation. The more relaxed, the better.
Every session we made today, I had a very different experience.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's very normal.
In the last 2, I felt anxiety. Because I felt like a babushka. Every time I felt like not in a loop, but like I'm going really far away from myself in a way.
In what sense? You mean you're losing your normal sense of identity?
Yeah, but in the mind.
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, in this practice, but also in the practice we did yesterday, once we really get into the practice and the body gets very relaxed and the solid sense of body will sort of dissipate, and then the mind tends to go quiet, and then there's no chit-chat there. So all of a sudden there's nothing reinforcing our normal sense of identity, because our normal sense of identity is coming from this solid body, this is me, and then all the thoughts, emotions and memories and everything, that's me as well. So when both of those go very quiet, then suddenly our normal sense of identity is gone. So as I mentioned earlier there, reading from that attention revolution, that often then we end up with a lot of fear arising because our normal sense of who we think we are is vanished. But again, this is irrational fear. The only thing that has vanished is a false sense of me. And so there's nothing to fear in resting in that open, spacious stillness. So to help understand that is also, we're going to be looking at the Vipassana practice to understand how we do exist as a person, so that we can understand that when this experience comes, then instead of actually some fear or anxiety coming up, we'll actually have more likely a sense of joy arising, because we'll realize that the me that I've identified with my entire life, the me that's caused so much suffering, simply doesn't exist. That sense of false sense of me doesn't exist. So that's often why this sort of experience can come up, particularly in this practice where we're not paying attention to the mental events and we're just resting in that open, spacious stillness of awareness. Does that sort of match your experience, that sense? of anxiety? Is it coming from that? This sort of normal sense of me is gone?
Or I will disappear.
Yeah, same. So it's an existential fear that feels like either we don't exist or we're going out of existence. Again, this is irrational fear, because the fact that you're experiencing fear proves you exist. Because if you don't exist, there can be no fear. So again, what to do there is a couple of things. One, of course, is to, when the fear arises, then like anything else, we can just observe it, not to get caught up in it. And also then to understand through our study and practice of Vipassana that what is disappearing is grasping to a false sense of me. And then there's nothing to fear at all. So this is what's going to be helpful. But of course, if it's still so much, then I would recommend going back into the body. If you can't release that fear, or you can't just watch it, then just go back into the body for a while.
So I have another question that I felt very strongly, or just came up a lot. What is the difference between consciousness and mind?
Okay. What's the difference between consciousness and mind? It really depends on how we use those words. As I mentioned before, in the context of awareness, these words consciousness and mind in different contexts can mean slightly different things. But again, if we're speaking very generally, then consciousness and mind are same. They mean the same. If we're speaking just very generally.
Because when observing the mind, I felt like it's mostly about text and
about
like text, verbal
yeah,
activity,
sure.
and some emotions.
Sure.
But in this meditation, I felt like my physical feelings, like senses, are also mind.
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, so mind is, with mind we experience mental and physical objects with one mind. We have one mind. So one presentation and there are many ways of dividing up the mind. One way is what's called the 6 consciousnesses. The mental consciousness, which is the part of the mind that is observing thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth. And then the 5 sense consciousnesses, like the visual consciousness is observing visual objects, the auditory sounds. But of course, this is not 6 different minds. There's one mind, and there are 6 aspects of one mind. So when we say 6 consciousnesses, we don't really mean 6 separate consciousnesses or 6 separate minds. 6 aspects of one mind. So then consciousness and mind are same thing. So with mind we observe thoughts, with mind we experience sounds, sensations, all of that. Right down the back.
When you refer to identity,
Identity?
when you refer to identity, is it the same as ego? And how do you differentiate?
So the question is identity and ego the same thing? To answer that, I'd have to ask you, what do you mean by the word ego? Because I think there are many different ideas about what the word ego refers to. So therefore, I tend not to really use it so much in the teachings, because if I say ego, then maybe in this class there's 6 different ideas or 10 different ideas about what that means. So therefore, if I use it, I always qualify it and say, okay, when I say ego equals grasping to independent me.
Exactly.
So but of course, I think there are many people who wouldn't think of ego in that way. So I think generally, often in psychology, the idea is to make an unhealthy ego healthy. In Buddhism, if we're using ego to mean that, we're trying to transcend the ego. if we're using the word ego to mean that, independent. Yeah.
Why don't the Tibetans invent a new vocabulary? Why do you take words and give them different meanings?
Well, that's why I don't use the word ego usually. I just use the words from Buddhism.
It's not permanent. Permanent is from here.
Well, that's because some translator early on decided to call it that, and it sort of stuck.
Yeah,
So
I wanted to suggest to you to rewrite the vocabulary. Honestly.
That's why. But that's
honestly,
yeah,
because it's ridiculous.
Sure.
You're quoting, but you're going on.
But that's why I tend to, when there's these confusions, I tend to go back to the Sanskrit. So I find that I'm using more and more Sanskrit terms. Exactly.
Much better.
Exactly, I agree with you. Better.
Few questions. First, are there any recorded statistics of people who reached enlightenment?
How many of people have achieved enlightenment? I mean, of course, if you look at the historical texts from India and Tibet and other places, then there's lots of references to many people who've achieved enlightenment. But, I mean, how do we know who's achieved enlightenment? Of course, they're probably not going to be wandering around saying, I've achieved enlightenment.
Why not?
Why not? Because, particularly in our modern society, people would think they're gone crazy and probably lock them up in a mental asylum. Seriously, no? I think that's what probably would happen. You know, we say, oh, there's another one of those fanatics there. So therefore...
We're trying to reach something that will qualify us as insane.
No, what I'm saying is that someone who's even before achieving enlightenment, they want to help others, generally they're not going around in public sort of boasting about how advanced they are. In private, if people need, they'll help them. And they'll be very humble about that.
So it will be much easier to find them in order to get help if they advertise that.
No, because usually the people who advertise are the actual ones who are not anywhere. So it's a very big danger. I mean, usually the ones who advertise themselves, we have to be very careful. 95% of the time, they're completely...
How about Shamatha?
How many people have achieved Shamatha? Again, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who have achieved Shamatha for sure, but again, how to know that? Difficult.
Okay. About the second question, about the assertion that the only real thing is the mind and everything else is a product of the mind.
The Shamatha view, we're going to look at that this evening.
Is that to say that my mind is the only one that exists?
So the question is that, you know, I mentioned briefly that one of the philosophical systems actually that we're going to look at now is called Chittamatra, and their assertion is that actually there's no external world at all, there's no material world at all, it's all internal to the mind. But the question then is, well, does that mean or imply that my mind is the only real thing? The term is solipsism. It doesn't imply that. So the Chittamatra view is not solipsism. Solipsism means that my mind is the only real thing, everyone else is just a figment of my imagination, no one else exists, I'm the only real thing in the universe.
Elaborate about it later?
I'll give a brief answer now because I don't think we'll go into that detail, but the assertion there with the Chittamatrans is that the reality we perceive, of course in all Buddhist traditions, what we experience is a result of our earlier actions. And so their assertion is that the world that is being produced by my mind, or our mind, is a very similar world to other humans, and there's an overlap, so it's overlapping reality. So that we all have our own universe, but they overlap, and that's why we can communicate. So that's sort of their assertion. very simply, what they're saying. And in a simple way, that's true, actually, isn't it? I mean, we all have our own unique experience, don't we? No two people have the same experience. I mean, even if we're looking at the same object, no two people have the same experience of that. So you could say, in some way, we're all living in our own universe. But of course we can communicate, can't we? So it's a little bit like that.
I'm not sure what's the difference between daydreaming and resting in awareness. When I'm daydreaming, am I not aware? Do I not know that I'm aware? Or?
When you're daydreaming, you're lost in your daydream. And you're caught up in lots of appearances. You're kidnapped by those appearances. You only realise you're daydreaming after you're out of your daydream. Then, oh, I was daydreaming. So while you're daydreaming, you're not aware of that. You're caught up, you're kidnapped by those appearances. So in this practice, of course, we're not lost, and we're certainly not kidnapped by any appearances, if we're in the practice of awareness.
You can be aware and continue to dream, understand? Like, I can be aware that I'm daydreaming, and then okay.
Yeah, but then it's like said, you're doing this. You're switching backwards and forwards very quickly between being lost in the daydream, having a few moments of awareness, lost, aware, you're going backwards and forwards.
But it's not the same dreams.
So,
It's not the same.
Okay.
It's not the same quality of dream.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there a way to discriminate? You said that there is like a threshold which gets more and more,
Lower?
lower when we, like in the meditation on the mind, when we think there is no thoughts, when actually our threshold is high.
Yeah.
So,
Well, as a beginner, often
Yes.
that's the case.
so is there a way to discriminate in this meditation on the mind and on the meditation on awareness between stillness and actually that there is really no thoughts and this situation in which we have just not reached the threshold?
So the question is there a way to know whether the mind is really still, or it's just that our threshold is up here?
Yeah.
I mean, that just comes with experience in the meditation in terms of clarity, to see that the clarity is missing. And that really only comes with experience. As we're going to start to look at these 9 stages tomorrow evening, and it really just comes through experience that, you know, as we progress, we'll go lower we've never been before, and we'll think, oh, that's it, and then we'll just keep moving down. And at each level, we'll probably think, well, that's it. You know, I've really got to the good level now. And then you keep practicing, and then suddenly it's lower and lower and lower. I mean, these levels, we've never been there before. So it's like uncharted territory. So it's completely, I mean, most of this that we uncover in this practice, most people have never experienced this in their entire life, because they've always been up here. So it's completely new.
And would that be also true to resting in awareness? Like, you talked about it in the...
Well, only in the sense of improving clarity, yeah. I mean, when you're resting in awareness, you could think, you know, my mind is very clear.
Yeah.
But then suddenly it becomes more clear, more clear, more clear. So there are also gradients of clarity as well.
So this stillness...
And that improved clarity is what brings the threshold down.
That's like, so what I can now experience as stillness will be actually more and more clear, you know? Like
The stillness, yeah. I mean, as you progress in the practice, that stillness or that non-conceptuality, remember there's those 3 qualities, clarity, non-conceptuality, bliss. So all 3 of those you will experience more and more and more the further you get along the path to Shamatha.
About the daydream, if
if you watch it like you watch a play, and you are aware that you watch a play, why you have to go forth and back and forth? Like
So it's not a daydream.
Then it's not a daydream. If you're watching it, you're not daydreaming.
If you're aware,
so you
Yeah.
say daydream is when you lost.
Yeah, when you're daydreaming, you're completely lost. You're caught up in it. That's what you say. Oh, I didn't hear what you said. I was daydreaming. So when you're watching it, then you're not in the daydream anymore. Again, it's this sort of...
So how you will call it?
lucid dream.
you just say you were just, I don't know,
To out.
imagining something.
Polemic.
I mean, I think normally when we say daydreaming, we're really like off. We're gone.
I have a problem with this knowing that I am aware.
Mhm.
Like, maybe it was solved. I would like to describe the process. Maybe it was solved, but I would like to describe
Sure.
the process. When I was practicing, it was in the morning, in the afternoon, maybe it was the solution. So my mind was very open and calm. The body was very open and calm. And
Sure.
nice experience. But then I remembered, oh, I have to know that I stay in this awareness. And so I thought, why do I have? Is it not? Why somebody like it was really a separation, looking for a separation between the knower and
Exactly. That's
and
why
awareness.
exactly. That's why I said it's difficult to give instruction. Even this knowing you're aware, you could think, well, okay, who's supposed to know this? Who's the knower who's knowing this? So that puts us into the dualistic mode. So it's very difficult to give any instructions. I mean, even if you say rest, you might think, oh, who's the agent that's resting? Who's the me that's resting in what? Of course this will, any words, I mean, language is dualistic. So any language we use can put us in duality mode. So it's very difficult to give instruction.
then in the afternoon, like maybe because of some Samhava,
Sure.
when I was practicing, then I thought, who is knowing? And then it was just a part of the awareness, and it sharpens the awareness.
Exactly. That's why he introduced it in the Shamatha, is it sharpened, that's why he brought it in. He said, if you're dull, do this, and it'll dispel your dullness. Seems like it worked. Very good.
The same thing, but for me, the who gave the other thing the other way around, because the who, I was looking for someone again.
Right. So
So
remember, in this practice here, in the Shamatha practice, we're not interested in knowing who's the observer, who's the agent, who's resting, who's doing this. That's all Vipassana practice. We only brought it in here from Padmasambhava for the purpose of sharpening the mind. So you ask a little question, and you have to look closely, and that sharpens your mind. Then you let go of the question. But generally in the Shamatha practice, you would not ask any questions at all. Like, who's doing this, who's the agent, who's the me, who's the observer. That's all Vipassana stuff.
yeah, but it's like yesterday for me. Just observe your own mind. Your own is again doing the same.
Again, any language will put us in dualistic mode. So it's difficult to give instruction for this practice. Because when we hear it, our mind is conceptual, it's dualistic. So whatever words you use, whatever verb you use, you'll think, well, there's an agent to that, and there's an object to that, and then there you have it. You have duality. So it's very difficult.
So I saw that at one point, just saying the thinking. You know, like this is what I said to myself, like the thinking. So I wouldn't attach to the word.
Yeah. Again, you can use whatever words help you to stay in that sort of non-dualistic mode.
And can I ask a question about Vajrayana?
Sure. I don't know if I'll be able to answer it, but you can ask.
I read somewhere, but I'm not sure if I understood correctly, that we need to be empowered or something to...
Right, so the question is that if we want to practice in Vajrayana, we need this thing called empowerment. yes, that the doorway of entry into Tantra or Vajrayana is what's called empowerment, where a tantric teacher will introduce you to your practice, and that introduction is through empowerment. It like empowers you to do the practice. So that's the way of going into it. So this generation and completion stage that I looked at, the generation stage, is often involving doing this what's called sadhana practice, and that there are many different forms of that, and the teacher would empower you to do that practice through this empowerment and explain the practice to you. So that's the sort of the door of entry into Vajrayana, through empowerment. Yeah. Yeah.
The last session, I felt that I'm very focused and aware, and I actually can rest there, and it felt kind of a soft feeling, and I felt that I'm relaxing, like my posture is, like my back is bending a little bit, like I'm becoming soft or curved.
Yeah.
And I was attracted to go with my intention, and I did remember that we're supposed to sit straight or back straight. And I was wondering about the posture at all. Why is the posture so strict? I mean, we said that we practice in meditation in order to bring it into daily life, right? And in daily life, I'm in all different kind of postures. So I was a very small struggle between myself. Should I go back to a straight back, or should I just? I am resting in awareness, I'm sure. So whatever.
Yeah. So the question is, why is posture so important in meditation?
And like the instructions keep saying, relax.
Yeah.
And I felt that was relaxation for me, and I chose to.
Yeah. So again, the idea with the posture is to put our body in a state where we can sort of forget about it, that it doesn't create any interference in our practice. So we want it to be the back straight and relaxed. Of course, if we're very stiff in the body and we're straining to keep the back straight, then it's going to be difficult to relax and have the back straight, because when we relax, it collapses, because we're straining to keep it straight. So then, if that's the case, we need to do something different with our posture. Generally, we need to sit on more cushions so that the back is naturally straight and we're not straining to keep it straight, because we tend to be very stiff and also not have a very good posture. So naturally, when we sit, naturally we're sort of like this, because in a modern society, many people work at a desk, and so we sit like this hour after hour all day. So this is our natural posture: curved back, curved shoulders, like this. So then, if we want to straighten it, we're doing something against our normal default position, and so we're having to strain to keep it like that. But then we need to work on changing the posture so that it's naturally straight, by usually adding more cushions so that you're naturally straight. Then you can be naturally straight, and then you can completely relax. Because if we're like this relaxed, it's easier, much easier to fall into dullness, and then at a more subtle level, the subtle energies are not going to flow as freely, and as a beginner, you're probably not going to notice that too much, but as you go deeper into the practice, you'll really start to notice that, and it'll start to become a little bit of an obstacle. So therefore, I would encourage to change the posture so that when you're sitting, the back is more naturally straight and you're not having to strain it to keep it straight. Okay? Last question, then we'll go to this evening's topic.
I'm meditating in awareness, what I believe is awareness.
Sure.
With stress and belief, yeah?
Well, believe only you know. You experience it.
So for me, I feel it's difficult for me in a sense. I sustain it.